Chapter 13. Is everyone seeing the presentation right now?
Yep.
All right, so chapter 13. And monopolies. Put our objectives up here. And let's talk about monopolies and how they arise. Who wants to tackle this?
Well, I would say a monopoly would be when, say, a firm gains a foothold into an industry and then either through legitimate practice or illegitimate practice maintains the lion's share, sometimes forcing others out or creating barriers for entry to other firms.
All right, well, a monopoly, you're right. A monopoly, a market with a single firm that produces a good or service with no close substitute. Here we're going to have a market where there's one supplier that is protected from competition by a barrier preventing the entry of new firms. Now, barrier of entry. A constraint that protects a firm from potential competitors. We're going to say that there's three types of barriers to entry. Natural, ownership, and legal. What's a natural barrier to entry?
They create natural monopoly. Where the scale is enable one firm to supply the entire market at the lowest possible cost.
All right, a natural barrier to entry. A market in which economies of scale enable one firm to supply the entire market at the lowest possible cost. Examples are going to include firms that can deliver gas, water, and electricity into our homes. All of these are going to be examples of natural barriers to entry. All right, now let me switch this up here. Now, legal barrier to entry. Trying to get my pointer working here. All right, so a legal barrier to entry. What do we see right here? I guess we're going to look at a graph here before we go to the other two types. What's this graph showing us? Definitely see a market demand curve. That's what we see when the D. We see a long run average cost curve sloping downward. What do you observe about the long run average cost curve? As quantity increases, what's happening to price?
Price is coming down.
Price is what?
Falling.
Falling.
Price is decreasing as quantity increases. What kind of situation did we just describe? What we just described are economies of scale. So here, the long run average cost curve shows us that we have economies of scale along the entire curve. Here we have a natural monopoly. One firm is able to distribute 4 million kilowatts. So the demand where it's intersecting here, one firm is able to create 4 million units of output. Two firms, we would say, could produce 4 million units of output. Now we say in a natural monopoly, economies of scale are so powerful that they are still being achieved even when the entire market demand is met. So again, we have economies of scale along this entire curve because price falls as output increases. Now, an ownership barrier to entry. If one firm owns a significant portion of a key resource, think of an example of this. Who's heard of De Beers, the diamond company? All right, at one point, De Beers controlled over 90% of the diamond market. That share has fallen to approximately 65% today. But earlier in the century, earlier in the last century, we'll say they achieved 90% market share in the diamond industry. So it's going to be something that is going to allow a firm to just own a significant portion. And we could say that if governments did not intervene, we could argue that's why we have laws to intervene with monopolistic actions or anti-monopolistic actions, is to prevent an ownership entry. Now, legal barriers. What's a legal barrier to entry? A market in which competition and entry are restricted by the granting of a public franchise. Examples being the United States Postal Service, government licenses. These can control particular occupations, professions, and industries. Examples being license to practice law or medicine. Finally, a patent or a copyright. What's a patent? A lot of times these get confused. So what's a patent?
Ownership of a good.
Ownership of a good. So you have exclusive ownership to a product or service. A copyright.
owning like a specific title, label, logo.
Music, art,
Right.
yes, good. And understanding that both of these time constraints are limited, and both, the limit of that time is going to vary between country and country. So what we have in the United States would not be the same as what we have in China. Okay, for a monopoly firm to determine the quantity it sells, it's going to have to decide what price it's going to sell this. A single price monopoly, a firm that must sell each unit out of its output for the same price to all its customers. Price discrimination is the practice of selling different units of a good or service for different prices. Who would argue if I said that you might have been discriminated against based off of price today? Would anyone agree with me? Sure you would. Look at this definition, the practice of selling different units of a good or service for different prices. Firms do this all the time. Just because they do it does not make them a monopoly. But again, what's your chief goal? If your chief goal is to maximize profit, you would ask, how can a firm maximize profit? Well, again, it's by achieving the highest total revenue at the lowest total cost. We get the highest total revenue by maximizing the price that we're selling our output for. There's a reason why I remember my granddad, when he went car shopping, I think he went and located the worst clothes and the oldest clothes that he could ever find. And those were the ones that he put on when he went to the auto lot. And his idea was he wanted to look as poor as a pauper when he walked onto the lot. So he said that that's lowered the negotiations right off the bat. All right, in a monopoly, remember, a firm is a price setter, not a price taker. In perfect competition, where we have many firms competing for business, there's many buyers and sellers. Market prices will set, and those that are supplying the market are price takers. In a monopoly, there are no competition, so you are supplying the entire market. You are a price setter. All right, so total revenue. We've defined it, price multiplied by quantity sold. Marginal revenue is the change in total revenue resulting from 1 unit increase in the quantity sold. So for a single price monopoly, marginal revenue is less than price at each level of output. And we can see this in figure 13.2. So again, here's our demand curve. And let's suppose the monopoly sets a unit price. We're going to use $16, and we're selling 2 units of output at 16. Now the firm cuts the price to 14, and we're going to sell 3 units. What just happened? It's going to lose $4 of total revenue. It's going to gain $14 of total revenue on the third unit. So what is the marginal revenue by going from 2 units to 3? $10. Now the marginal revenue curve. What do we observe? Marginal revenue, $10. So as we increase from 2 to 3 units of output, marginal revenue is $10. A single price monopoly's marginal revenue is related to elasticity of demand. If demand is elastic, a fall in price is going to bring an increase in total revenue. That is how we would describe marginal revenue as positive. All right, so remember, if demand is elastic, marginal revenue is positive. So here we see a fall in price. If we look at figure A, we see right here that price is falling. And what's happening to total revenue? It increased. Now the increase in revenue from the greater quantity sold outweighs the the quantity decrease in revenue from the lower unit. So again, if marginal revenue is positive, I ask here, are we still maximizing profit? We're still maximizing profit up to the point that marginal revenue is exceeding marginal cost. So as long as we have not passed marginal cost, yes, we are exceeding. Now, if demand is inelastic, a fall in the price brings a decrease in total revenue. And we're going to say that marginal revenue is negative in this example. So look here, we have a demand curve at D. Marginal revenue curve is shown to us, and marginal revenue curve can dip down below at a range of 0 to 5 haircuts. Is that what we're doing, haircuts? Yes. So at a range of 0 to 5 haircuts, what's a price increases? What are we gaining from that price increase? What's happening to total revenue? When a range of 0 to 5, a price cut increases total revenue. So from 0 to 5, that's why we are elastic. Now what about from a range of 5 to 10? When we cut price, what happens? Total revenue is going to decrease. So here we observe that marginal revenue is negative. Here's another way of observing. And here's this term, unit elastic. If demand is unit elastic, a fall in the price does not change total revenue. And that is when we say total revenue would be maximized. And we gain nothing at that point. Zero marginal revenue. Remember, in a monopoly, demand is always elastic. Never produces an output at which demand is inelastic. Now, what kind of constraints do monopolies face? Same types of technology constraints as a competitive firm, but the monopoly faces a different market constraint. Profit maximizing quantity. So remember I asked a while ago, at what point will a firm maximize profit? And that is the point to where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Highlight that because I'm pretty certain you will see that question again. So the monopoly sets its price at the highest level at which it can sell under a profit maximizing quantity. So figure 13.4 illustrates profit maximizing choices of a single price monopoly. And here we are. Part A. The distance between we call economic profit. So the vertical distance between total revenue and total cost is equal to economic profit. And that is represented by 3 haircuts per hour. Now at 3 haircuts per hour, at what price are we going to sell for? Why are we selling at $14? All right, we're going to look to the demand curve. Now look, what does a monopoly do when it incurs any type of economic loss? Here we're going to highlight another red flag and why we frown. If you were the only supplier in town and you started incurring economic losses, in a competitive market, if a firm starts incurring economic losses and they pull out and exit the industry, what might happen?
As long as there's still revenue, as long as there's still profit to be made, you'll have other firms enter the market.
Absolutely. As long as demand is still there and profit is to be made, more firms would enter the market. If new firms did not enter the market, others might at least gain market share and pick up any slack. But in a monopoly, if they start incurring economic losses, they could shut down, hoping demand would come back, or could completely exit the market. So here, let's look at perfect competition, price and quantity from a perfect competition economy and a monopoly. Here's our demand curve. So in perfect competition, the demand curve, as price decreases, what happens to quantity?
The quantity demanded increases.
As price decreases in a perfectly competitive market, we say that as price decreases, the amount demanded will decrease. Now the market supply curve in perfect competition, the horizontal sum, think of a good way to illustrate this. All right, so we're going to go back to the perfectly competitive market in figure 13.5. All right. So here we said, this is where we pick back up. Compares the price and quantity in a perfectly competitive market. Now I want you to imagine that in this perfectly competitive market, we got many firms that are competing. Now I want you to imagine that a single firm buys out all of these firms and creates a monopoly. What do you expect to happen? Will price rise or fall?
Rise.
Price will rise, you think. Will the quantity increase? Well, excuse me, will the quantity produced, will output increase or decrease? I hear decrease here. Will economic profit increase or decrease? All right, these are questions we're going to attempt to answer here. So let's see who's right. So figure 13.5, market curve. Here we look at D. So this is going to represent our demand curve. And we see it's the same regardless of how any industry is organized. So again, as price in a perfectly competitive market, we just said that as price falls, demand is going to increase. Now, let's look at the supply curve. And what can we say about the supply curve? All right, if this is a perfectly competitive market, we'd say this supply curve represents all the individual firms in the market. And what do we call the point of where the supply curve intersects with the demand curve?
Equilibrium.
That's our equilibrium point. Now, let's introduce a factor called PC. So we're going to have P and the subscript C and Q and the subscript C. So equilibrium occurs where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. We're calling that at quantity C and at price P subscript C. So in a perfectly competitive market, there is perfect competition. The demand curve and the supply curve interact. Now when a monopoly, so now let's say that all of our individual firms just got bought out. So we're going to have an ownership barrier to entry here. Firm comes in and starts buying out all the competition. Consumers do not change, so the market demand curve remains the same. Just because we take out the number of suppliers, demand would still remain the same. But now, how's the monopoly going to view the demand curve? To a monopoly, the demand curve is going to be viewed as a constraint. It's a constraint because it's going to highlight and show the price in which it can sell its output. And this is what we observe with the marginal revenue curve. Now, how is the monopoly going to maximize profit? Remember, we'll maximize profit where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. All right, now let's look here. We're going to start out by showing efficiencies of a perfect competition. All right, now once we're studying, we often use models of perfect competition as a way to study and measure influences of monopolies. So along the demand curve, if we're sitting here, we look at marginal social benefit curve, and we're going to say let that equal the demand curve. And then along the supply curve, the marginal social cost curve is equal to supply curve. Now, once we put in, and again, we're not going to define equilibrium as anything different. We're going to say that equilibrium is where the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. And now let's look at it from a monopoly's view. All right, we said that in a perfectly competitive market, efficiency was where marginal social benefit equaled marginal social revenue. And we can define where the consumer surplus lies. Now, who can explain this?
Charles, this is something I think I emailed you on Sunday about. I'm not sure how to explain the consumer or the producer surplus. I'm not sure what those, exactly what those represent.
Who can help explain this? Are you asking what is a consumer surplus and how to relate it?
Like you have too many customers and not enough product to go around? Like at my dealership, you know, all of a sudden people want an Equinox. We don't have enough Equinoxes to go around. Like that?
Like when gas prices fall and everybody wants the big SUVs and
So like right now, everyone wants a Cruise, but blue Cruise, we don't got blue.
And when gas prices rise, yes, everybody wants the electric vehicles. All right, so we're going to say that a consumer surplus occurs when the consumer, let's relate this to some prices. Consumer surplus occurs when the market, when the consumer is willing to pay more for a product than the current market price.
Housing.
Housing. Did someone say housing?
Yes, a lot of people are now, we talked about this last week, or 2 weeks ago, the housing market, people are going in either at the asking price or above.
Correct. Kind of scary.
So would that be
That'd be the
consumer
consumer
surplus?
surplus.
Okay.
Brian, thanks for asking that question right now. I knew we were going to include that
Get there.
in today's discussion. But yes, right now, I would say the best example that we can observe in our economy is within the housing market. And in the last class, we did talk about, I don't know, you know, it seems like Wisconsin is the same as what we're viewing here in Indiana. But folks are coming in and asking, you know, market prices on real estate, residential real estate at least. It's definitely a seller's market right now.
Yep.
And individuals are willing to spend more what the current market price is. All right, so where were we? So Monopoly comes in. All right, let me get my thoughts back. Then we asked, would they cut output? What was our answer? So in this chart, let the figure Q subscript M. Here's what we're going to refer to. Let Q subscript M represent production. This is the quantity produced. P subscript M is the price in which we're going to sell it for. So what would happen, what do we observe happening when we go from perfectly competitive all of our firms get bought up, we're now in a monopoly. What's happening to quantity produced? It's going to decrease, it's going to fall. And as it decreases, what's happening to the price?
Price goes up.
Price is going to increase. Now, what we observe here is that the smaller output and the higher price is going to drive a wedge between the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost and create this dead weight loss. And that'll be represented by the gray area. Now, this is going to cause consumer surplus to decrease. Who wants to tackle why consumer surplus would shrink?
I think people get to a point where if you might as well just wait, either something new, like electronics or something, wait until something else comes out that can replace it, and then usually the price of that product that you were originally trying to fight for will eventually come down.
Correct. At some point, consumers are going to realize that they are actually losing on the increased price that they're paying. Second, as if the price would increase, again, consumers are going to realize that they are getting less of that product because they're paying more for it. So once the realization comes that we're getting less for our money and we're actually losing on our money because we're paying above market prices, we would start to see this surplus shrink. And that was the chart that we just saw. Now, some of the lost consumer surplus goes to the monopoly as a producer surplus. Now, who will define a producer surplus?
Something like too many producers making one product all at once. So they would have competition themselves.
All right, you've kick-started it. Our producer surplus is the economic measure of the difference between the amount a producer of a good receives and the minimum amount that producer would accept. The difference between the amount a producer of a good receives and the minimum amount the producer is willing to accept. All right, so in this, hang on, let us shut this door. Another classroom just let out. All right, rent seeking. All right, so we've seen that a monopoly creates a dead weight loss, and we're going to say monopolies are inefficient. All right, but the social cost of a monopoly can exceed the dead weight loss because of an activity we will define as rent seeking. And rent seeking, any surplus, consumer or producer, or economic profit is called economic rent. Pursuit of wealth by capturing economic rent is defined by rent seeking. So just know rent seekers pursue their goals in two main ways. They buy a monopoly or they create a monopoly using resources and political activity. The pursuit of economic profit is the attempt to capture consumer surplus. We do that by buying a monopoly or creating a monopoly. All right, buying a monopoly. To rent seek by buying a monopoly, a person is going to search for a monopoly that's for sale at the lowest price. They purchase it at the lowest price, they are going to boost the monopoly's economic profit. All right, now examples that we find in society right now. I'm not so much in this area, but let's go to larger metropolitan areas and you're going to see trading of taxi cab licenses.
They're in competition with Uber.
Uber, good point. I do know that it's a lot of taxi cabs, as Uber right now is trying to become regulated, and who regulates, but taxi cab markets do become regulated because of individuals willing to trade their licenses. All right, so what's gonna happen to this consumer surplus when we start taking on rent-seeking actions?
Surplus would go down. Because you would have more competition.
Okay, we're gonna say that you're saying it's going down.
Going down.
And if it goes down, what effect is that gonna have on the social side?
The social side would decrease as well.
So society would bear the cost.
Right.
The producers would get rid of the surplus, but at whose cost?
Producer's costs.
Well, we just defined it could be at society's cost.
Okay, society's costs.
Price discrimination. As I said, you might have been victim, and I don't even want to say victim, but price discrimination today. Go to the movies, buy a car, buy a home, attend sporting events. Seems the class was pretty evenly divided on concert tickets. Paid on discussions on concert ticket prices. And I would agree with a lot of those that it has definitely went up. But again, the act of selling different units of a good or service for different prices. Going back to the movie ticket, that same movie ticket is going to cost various prices throughout the day. I would venture to say at an auto dealership, take that Chevy Equinox, and ever how many you sold this week, it is doubtful that every customer paid the same exact price.
Correct.
All right, so that's what we define as price discrimination. So realizing that it does occur, but within a monopoly, we're still going to say no. So to be able to discriminate, a monopoly must identify and separate different buyer types and sell a product that cannot be resold. So again, if they're reselling, there can't be any opportunity for redistribution. All right, now here's some other examples of the way a monopoly can discriminate. Now, by discriminating, monopolies capture consumer surplus and convert it all into a producer surplus. Who can answer this question? More producer surplus means more economic profit. Why would a producer surplus, an increase in producer surplus, represent more economic profit?
Is it because for the producer surplus to increase, the consumer surplus has to decrease?
For the producer surplus to increase would mean that the consumer surplus would decrease. Correct, but remember that we define producer surplus as the amount the producer is actually receiving compared to the minimum amount they are increasing. So if we're widening that spread, that means that producers are receiving more revenue or higher revenue than the minimum amount that would be accepted. So let's look. Economic profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost. Nothing new here. Producer surplus is total revenue minus the area under the marginal cost curve. And we can define that and let's look at price discrimination of an airline. All right, here we have a monopoly on passenger flights. And we see the market demand curve, and that's going to be based on travel. We also see the airline's marginal revenue curve and the marginal cost curve. And it looks like the marginal cost curve is constant. And we've pegged that at $40 per trip. All right, so we've already said that there's a monopoly. Marginal cost is $40 as a single price monopoly. Marginal revenue. Where are we going to maximize profit? How many trips?
8,000.
8,000. One way of looking at that is at what point do we see the largest spread? All right, so marginal profit is maximized by selling 8,000 trips, and those 8,000 trips are going to be priced at $120 per trip. So the producer surplus in the blue rectangle, let me put the rectangle right here. Let's first look at the consumer surplus, no producer surplus. So producer surplus, $640,000. So let's just look at the area under the curve shown in the blue box is a producer surplus. Can the airline increase its producer surplus by price discriminating? Let's see. Let's put two different travelers on here. All right, so now the airline is going to survey and find out that all of its travelers are not in the same category. They're going to find that people travel for business and leisure. So we're going to have two different types of travelers. Those who travel by leisure can also take what? Probably more likely to take other modes of transportation like bus and a car. And just think, if you travel for business or you travel for leisure, usually you're the one putting the price on the leisure side, so price is going to be more of a factor when comparing different modes. And if the price was too high, you would be more attracted to traveling by different modes of transportation. All right, so first, let's look at business travel. And we 13A. And let's put up leisure travel. All right, so in figure A, we see that of the business travel. In figure B, we see that of the leisure travel. And in part B, what's the maximum amount an individual is willing to spend to travel?
$120.
$120. And at $120, what is demand?
Zero.
Zero. So the maximum amount is 120, but demand is zero. But the marginal cost is going to remain at 40. So where are they going to maximize profit? Again, at 4,000 trips. So if I put that marginal revenue curve up, we see that profit is maximized at 4,000 trips, priced at $80 a trip. Now, what happens if we increase to 12,000 trips a week? Consumer surplus increases, and the airline's producer surplus increases.
So it's a win-win.
It's a win-win. Now, we'll just define perfect price discrimination occurs if a firm is able to sell each unit of output for the highest price someone's willing to pay. And again, this is going to be the result of firms trying to capture even a larger part of the consumer surplus. In order to do this, they're going to have to come up with some type of special condition. All right, these special conditions are going to have to appeal to a small segment of the market. And it's going to have to exclude others from taking advantage of, at a lower price. Now, with perfect price discrimination, something special is going to happen to the marginal revenue. The market demand curve becomes the marginal revenue curve. The reason is that when a monopoly cuts the price to sell a larger quantity, it sells only the marginal unit at the lower price. All the other units continue to be sold for the highest price that each buyer is willing to pay. So for the market price to be discriminating, marginal revenue equals price, and the market demand curve becomes the marginal revenue curve. Let's look at some regulations. How are we going to take a look? Let me give you some examples. Let's look at a more modern day example. Again, let's pick on Microsoft. Not really picking on them, but Microsoft probably a good example of a discussion on monopolies in a more modern example. Is Microsoft a monopoly?
Yes, no.
Did I hear yes and no?
Yeah. They're not a monopoly in the sense that there's other companies like them, but they have a niche. Like their product is different compared to the rest of the competition, if that makes sense. Like Dell.
All right, let's just try to find one answer. Would you call them a monopoly or not? Definitely have a niche, I agree. But at one point our government did file and review. I mean, Microsoft had to defend some of its practices. I mean, I think it's pretty interesting right now that, you know, I am an Apple. I'm thinking probably in my household, all of my business applications are run on Microsoft, but all of my personal consumptions are used through Apple. But I can pick my MacBook or I can pick my iPads up right now and open up Microsoft Word. I can pull an Excel spreadsheet up. Now, was that the case 10 years ago? No. I mean, right, the last figure, Microsoft controls approximately 85% of the market for computer operating systems. If you strip out Apple, it's going to control closer to 100% of that market. Based on those numbers, I would say that they are a monopoly. Now, Microsoft is what we would call a natural monopoly. Would you believe that they have large fixed costs and nearly zero marginal cost? So its long run average cost curve would slope downward, and just like we saw in the prior example, they're going to realize economies of scale throughout that entire curve. Now, Microsoft sells Windows for a number of different prices to different market segments. So now I just accused Microsoft of being a price discriminator, monopoly. Realize too is the disclaimer, let me say I'm not picking up Microsoft. My intention is not to beat up Microsoft. I'm stating facts. So definitely we do say they are a price discriminator. And if you refer to your textbook, there's a nice little section there titled Economics in the News, and you're going to get some more figures that are going to go along with this discussion. All right, so remember, I told you I use Microsoft. I like Microsoft. I'm not trying to pick them up. Beat them up. All right, so monopoly regulation. We'll define regulation as rules administered by a government agency to influence prices, quantities, entry, and other aspects of economic activity. Two theories. First, the social interest theory. Now, before I get to here, what's the opposite of regulation?
Deregulation.
Deregulation. That's the process of removing any type of regulation on prices, quantities, entries, and any other aspect of economic activity. All right, so let's look at regulation though. Two theories exist on how to best regulate. Social interest theory says that the political and regulatory process seek out efficiency and regulates to eliminate dead weight loss. Now, based on our discussion boards from week 5, I can say that, again, we saw a lot of different opinions voiced. And some of you even saw me reply to you and ask what you might recommend or what thoughts you would have to become more efficient. And so listen up. Social interest theory. Second is the capture theory. This is the regulation serves the self-interest of the producer, who in turn will capture the regulator and maximizes economic profit. All right, efficient regulation of a natural monopoly. And again, we just defined Microsoft as a natural monopoly. All right, imagine a cable company. Here's another example of a natural monopoly. Cable company can supply your entire market at a lower price than 2 or more competing firms can. And here I've dug up, I'm going to pick on, quit using the word pick on. I'm going to highlight, I like that better. I'm going to highlight Cox Communications. This one because it's a market outside of any of ours. Cox Communication is based out of Atlanta. Provides cable TV to households in 20 states. Firms recently invested heavily in satellite receiving dishes, cables, and control equipment. Based off of all of that, you know they've got large fixed costs. And these fixed costs are going to be part of the firm's average total cost. Now, if the average total cost decreases as the number of households served increases, that is what we're going to expect because we're taking that cost and spreading it over a larger customer base. Unregulated right now, Cox produces the quantity that maximizes profit. And like all single price monopolies, the price maximizing quantity is less than the efficient quantity. And we're going to have an underproduction here, and that's going to create our dead weight loss. So how can Cox be regulated to produce the efficient quantity of cable TV service? We're going to introduce the marginal cost pricing rule. This is regulation that sets the price equal to the question. All right, marginal cost pricing rule, regulation that sets the price equal to the monopoly's marginal price, marginal cost. And here the quantity demanded at a price is equal to marginal cost. So this is a way that they are going to encourage the supplier to produce a quantity that is efficient. And figure 1311 is going to illustrate the marginal cost pricing curve. Again, observe the demand curve illustrated by D. So this is going to be the demand curve for, let's just stick to this example of cable TV. All right, so the demand curve, the marginal cost curve. At what price are we intersecting the marginal cost curve? All right, it's at $10. So the efficient outcome is going to occur if the price is regulated at $10 per month, reaching 10 million households. So if we are regulating the monopoly based on the social interest, we're going to do that at a point of where marginal social benefit is equal to marginal social cost. Now let's look at a second best regulation. All right, so a natural monopoly cannot always be regulated to achieve an efficient outcome. Two possible ways to regulate to avoid economic loss. We're going to use the average cost price rule. And next, we're going to look at a government subsidy. Implementing an average cost pricing can be a problem because it's not possible for the regulator to be sure what the firm's going to do. All right, if we do have regulation, remember that costs are going to vary, and it's no way that the government agency set with regulation is going to be able to come in and see what that price is, what that cost is to that individual firm. Okay, because of that, they would have to make some assumptions. And they are going to use one of two practical rules: rate of return regulation and price cap regulation. A firm must justify its price by showing that its return on capital doesn't exceed a specified target rate. What industry does that sound like right now? And again, this was an industry that was talked about when you were asked, what does what benefit, or what impact has government had on your household in recent years? What is one industry that came up?
Healthcare.
Healthcare, good point. Right now, the healthcare industry, health insurers, if they do overpriced premium, and remember that they're only allowed to capture a certain target rate, and any excess has to be returned back to insureds. So a health insurer has to spend, their costs have to hit a threshold of all the dollars that it collects in premium, and any excess above that threshold, you see premium dollars being returned. All right, this type of regulation can end up serving the self-interest of the firm rather than the social interest, because firm managers has an incentive to inflate cost and use more capital than the efficient amount. Price cap regulation. Rule specifies that the highest price that the firm is permitted to charge. Now, this type of regulation gives the firm an incentive to operate efficiently and keep its costs under control. Remember, they're going to set the maximum price that the firm can charge. So let's look here. And again, I'm going to keep picking on the cable operator. All right, so without regulation, where are we going to maximize profit?
$60 per household.
Reaching
Households.
6 million households. Now, if we set a price cap of $30, the firm now is permitted to sell any quantity it chooses at that price or lower. So now at 5 million households, what's happening? At 5 million households, the firm is going to incur an economic loss. Now, how could it battle this economic loss? Well, you might argue it could decrease its cost. Or by increasing the amount of households it serves up to 8 million. Now, here's often where I say entrepreneurship runs counterintuitive to economics at times. It might not be as easy to increase the number of households to that quantity. But that would be the only way that it could continue to maximize. It would have to reach more households, assuming that it could not squeeze out any more efficiencies in cost. The only other way to provide that additional revenue, if price was lowered, would be to increase the number of households that were reached.